Okay, welcome to Parish and Community. I'm speaking with Danielle Harrison and Kelly Schmidt of the Slavery, History, Memory, and Reconciliation Project. Thank you both for joining me today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
So tell us what the Slavery, History, Memory, and Reconciliation Project is. How did it get its start?
Kelly, do you want to do the beginning and I'll jump in at the second part?
Sure. The Slavery, History, Memory, and Reconciliation Project began in 2016 as members of the Jesuit Central and Southern Province and St. Louis University, in the wake of events like Ferguson and the Clock Tower Accords on St. Louis University's campus, realized they needed to investigate their own history of slaveholding and its legacies and work to connect with descendants to inform how the Jesuits should move forward in addressing these histories today.
So yeah, in 2016, we did a presentation for the Jesuits of the Central and Southern Province. But it is a work of the conference, so it's a work for all of the Jesuit provinces in the United States and Canada and Puerto Rico. But I think the main, again, goal and focus of the project is not only to reach out to descendants and to look at our history with Jesuit slaveholding, but to also be really intentional about transformative ways in which we can heal and do reconciliation from this really negative part of our past. And to do that with the descendants. So that's not something that we, as the Jesuits, say, we're going to do for you. Like there's enough of us telling them what to do. This is an opportunity for us to work really together, healing, struggling, and yet being transformed by the familial ties, actually, between the two.
How did the two of you become involved?
Would you like to start, Danielle?
Sure. So in 2016, I was working at a Jesuit high school in St. Louis, SLU High, and was invited to speak at the Jesuit Colloquium, which is a thing for the high schools of the country get together, the Jesuit high schools. And I spoke on compassion and race. It was right after the Mike Brown incident. And I have some really strong passion about dealing with diversity and equity and inclusion and talking about having these courageous conversations in Jesuit schools. And at that time, I was approached by Father Ron Mercier, who was the provincial, and said that they were starting to do this work, this particular work, and wanted me to be involved. So I was kind of a consultant. I was on the province advisory team committee for a while, and then just really felt called to be in it full time. And so starting, I just ended my first month as the co-director. Yeah. Kelly?
I began in this work in about 2016 as well. I'm a PhD candidate in United States history and public history, and my focus is on the history of slavery, African American history, race, and abolition in the United States. Prior to this, I spent about 8 years working at the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center in Cincinnati. And I also have ties to the Jesuits. I went to Xavier University in Cincinnati for undergrad and Loyola University, Chicago for grad school. So I understood the history of slavery in the United States and the history of the Jesuits. And I was able to put the two of those together to better understand what life was like for people held in slavery to the Jesuits in the 18th and 19th centuries. And it led me to have a personal stake in the work, knowing that I benefited in getting education from these institutions, which have benefited from holding people in slavery. And I wanted to learn more about that.
Yeah. What kind of source? Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I think it is very powerful to be involved in the work. I frequently say that Ignatian spirituality has kept me, kept my faith strong, has helped me to live out my faith in a way that felt really comfortable. and balance. As an African American woman, a lot of the similarities that line up between an African American spirituality and a nation spirituality, both Bible-based, both community kind of oriented, both socially focused, right? So it was just really wonderful to find that opportunity and to work with the Jesuits. I've worked with them in a number of spaces, not just teaching at their schools, but I was also on the province staff in Missouri in the early 90s. So to find out this history was really shocking and challenging, because I realized that I had an opportunity now to help my brothers to see their sin and to help them reconcile. So so it was an invitation, but it's also it does cost sometimes.
Sure. Yeah. What kind of source materials do you use when you're tracing the histories of people who had been enslaved, owned by Jesuits?
We've used all kinds of different source materials, but two of the most important ones that we've used are Sacramental records and Jesuit financial ledgers. And I think those two records in themselves say so much about what life was like for people held in slavery to the Jesuits. In financial records, enslaved people are treated as commodities. They're recorded there for their value in terms of their labor, in terms of their bodies. But through them, we can glean more than what the Jesuits were intending to write down. We can learn more about what their daily life was like. But then when we look at Sacramental records, we see that more about enslaved people as families, enslaved people and how they approach their faith. And it shows that even though the Jesuits treated enslaved people as commodities, that they also had to reckon with their humanity, that they saw them as worthy of salvation, worthy of being baptized, worthy of being married. And so I think those two types of records really show how complicated the history of enslavement to the Jesuits was.
Are there any contemporaneous documents that have any Jesuits reflecting on this practice in any way?
Yeah, some. The Jesuits kept a volume called the Woodstock Letters that they contributed to from the period of enslavement to going forward. And there's lots of Jesuit reflections of all different kinds about their role in this history of slave holding. And I'm also thinking in particular of the memoirs of Father William Marku, who was pastor of St. Elizabeth Parish. In the 1930s, a man came to his door and introduced himself as Washington. And he said to Marku, "Father, I was one of your boys." And Marku said back to him, "Well, as a pastor, everyone as God's children are my children." And Washington replied back to him, "No, I was one of your boys at Florissant," which is where the Jesuits had their plantation. And in listening to Washington, Marku slowly learned his history, that he and his parents were enslaved to the Jesuits, that he ran away when he was about the age of 18 during the Civil War, and that he had been struggling to make ends meet ever since. And Marku reflected in his memoir, "I wondered what sort of restitution the Jesuits owed for Washington and his parents' unrequited labors as enslaved people at Florissant."
Yeah, and I would say too, in just even more recently, in 2016, when we presented the information, Kelly presented the information that she'd found to the Central and Southern Province during Province Days. You could see the shock and pain, even on the faces of the Jesuits themselves as they heard this history. It's not as if it wasn't, people didn't know about it, but we just never spoke about it. It was just kind of there. And so when you could hear, and Kelly did such a beautiful job of naming those that were enslaved so that they weren't just a commodity, but gave them their human dignity. And so you could see the wrestling that was happening and continues to happen with the Society of Jesus currently about this. And so I think it's an ongoing process, a discerning of how to deal with the information, that the history of their family, of what they did, and how do they reconcile that today.
I can certainly say from a parishioner perspective, hearing about College Church and St. Louis University and the history of enslaved people there, just realizing it's a different sort of realization, because, you know, you have this sort of like abstract, well, the United States, and so our whole economic system has slave roots. But to think of a particular institution that you are a part of, and the particular people who were enslaved by that institution, does put a more concrete experience to it.
Mm-hmm.
So tell me, what makes the research a challenge? What are some of the challenges that are inherent in the research of this topic?
I think what you just said about institutions strikes me as one of the challenges in doing this research. Slavery didn't operate in isolation. We can't just go to one archive to learn everything about someone's experiences. Slavery did violence on Black bodies. It tore apart Black families. It forced people across the country as they were sold and moved to other locations. And enslaved people were prohibited from being able to do things like learning how to read and write. So it's rare that family archives from enslaved people survive. The records about them are written by their owners and kept by their owners. And therefore we have to follow their owners' paths and find their records and try to reinterpret what owners wrote in their own perspectives to understand how enslaved people experienced all of this. And so we've had to look in all kinds of different places. Here in St. Louis, we've looked at the Jesuit Archives and Research Center, St. Louis University Archives, the Missouri State Archives, the Missouri History Library, the Archdiocese Archives, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the list goes on. And it's so important to look in all those places, because if we don't, we won't be able to tell the full story. I know that a story that's very particular to College Church is one that it took us a long time to figure out, the story of Matilda Tyler. And when we first began uncovering records about her life, the only two records we had were the Board of Trustees of St. Louis University's decision to emancipate Matilda Tyler's sons, Samuel, Thomas, George Jr., and Edward. And the other records we had were at the Jesuit Archives and Research Center, and they were the actual deeds of emancipation for her sons.
Wow.
And from those records alone, it was too easy for someone to infer that by some act of benevolence, the Jesuits were deciding to free this enslaved family. And we were immediately skeptical of that, even though we didn't have more information. And as we continued our research, we were going through financial records at SLU's archives, and we saw a line in a ledger that said Matilda Tyler, emancipation of Negro family, with a monetary amount. And then as we kept looking, we found multiple pages of ledger entries where Matilda Tyler was keeping accounts in the names of her sons, gold, silver, cash to the Jesuits to buy their freedom. And then at the Jesuit Archives, we found an entry that said Matilda Tyler, she is to have her freedom if she pay $350 to be appropriated to St. Xavier College Church.
Wow.
So if we had only stopped at looking at those first two records, we wouldn't have been telling the full story. And now we have a more complete picture. It wasn't an act of benevolence on the part of the Jesuits, it was a transaction. And Matilda had to negotiate with the Jesuits in order to be able to buy her and her sons freedom.
Wow.
And imagine then the toll of not just being able to leave, like to, you know, she couldn't buy all of them at once, right? So that she's working. And so imagine the toll of thinking, who am I working for now? Who am I going to try to get now, and pray that they're not sold or, you know, disappeared before she can get the money together. I mean, I think that those are the kinds of stories that we fail to understand, and what what we're trying to do with our project is to really put a human face and the story of a life of what these people who had been enslaved had to really go through, so that we don't just see them as objects, which is why we don't say slavery or slaves. They're just slaves. We want to acknowledge them as people. We don't want to acknowledge them through their occupation or what they were chosen to do. So the more that we can give a name, a face, hear the story, because then it relates to what we live today. Like when let's say we're short on money, we have to decide what bill we're going to pay, right? Or, what groceries are we going to eat that day? But again, this is the kinds of things that they were trying to negotiate in the 1800s. And still to this day, the ramifications of that are still being felt.
Sure. The part of your work also is connecting then to the descendants of those who were enslaved by Jesuits. And I'm trying to imagine what the initial conversations look like. Are folks reaching out to you? Are you reaching out to them? How does that look?
So in the beginning, as we started to identify certain descendants, we reached out to them with a kind of a formal letter, just kind of saying, this is some information that we found. We're available to talk through this if you'd like to come and see what we've located. And then we did a couple of other kind of outreaches like that. And we've gotten responses from that where people have called back and said, yes, I'd like to know, or some maybe not. But again, we are trying to let the descendants lead us in how best to form that relationship. But as word of mouth, because that works great. So we visited a number of churches and African-American churches in the community. We have gone to a number of different meetings, and now as people find out, they contact us. So it's just kind of all kinds of ways. In fact, we got an email today. Kelly got an email saying, hey, I think I'm related to this person. And so we're just open to any way that we can try to connect.
Do you have then ongoing, depending on how folks want to maintain the relationship, does that look like ongoing conversations? Is it does it also reflect into the larger Jesuit body that you then talk with the Jesuits about how this is going to proceed as far as because one of the things that I appreciate about this project is that it is not just like, well, what do we do? Like there does seem to be a very contemplative, like, okay, we're going to sit with this information, but I'm sure there's also a conversation about within the sitting what actions might proceed.
Sure, there's always, Jesuits always love to be doing, like they're action, men of action, right? And I'm always like contemplatives and action. So we want to balance both. But I also think the work of the project, since it is a conference work, we are reaching out to the descendants. We are trying to formulate relationships so that we're moving in partnership. So sometimes that might mean we have to wait. We might want to do something really quickly, but if the descendants are still trying to grapple with the information, sometimes it might be the first time they've even heard of this is when we've sent out a letter saying.
Yeah.
So we really want to just take our lead from what the descendants say, but at the same time, we are working within the Jesuit apostolates and the Jesuit community, just kind of to get their brains, understanding what's going on. So if that means we talk to Jesuits, let's say in California, who might say on the surface, what does this have to do with me? Like Californians didn't have enslaved. And we say, well, but you have benefited because you came from this area. So there's a kind of a two-tier, I want to say, education or piece. So when we get involved with some Jesuits who are like, well, what are we going to do? What's the answer? I say, well, let's just talk first of all about your role in it and how are you feeling? Let's do an examine just on what's going on with you. Meanwhile, then again, continuing to open up and communicate with the descendants. I would say that we're entering a phase of the work right now where we will be reaching out to more and more descendants, and that might start to shape a little bit more what happens. I think this first phase was just kind of getting established, getting our feet, you know, wet, and just kind of knowing the ins and outs of how we were going to communicate.
What would you like to share with other institutions who may be unsure of how to address the legacy of slavery within their own histories?
Want me to go first, Kelly?
Please.
So it's very interesting. I'm a Visitation Academy graduate. So I went to Visitation from 1st to 12th grade. And the Visitation Sisters of Georgetown have also done this work and have done a really a working project of looking at their slave holdings. So I would say to other institutions that it is scary work, but it is really necessary work. This is the work that our faith calls us to do. Given where we are in the country right now, just in terms of courageous conversations around race and racism, this is paramount in this conversation, to give people a sense of who they are, right? And to understand that, to honor the human dignity that was for so long ignored. So I know that it's tough work to do, but it is imperative that the investigation be done. And not to criticize, but to have a fuller understanding of one's own history, and to be able to offer that kind of information or healing to someone else.
Right.
You know, a lot of descendants may say, you know, I've tried to do genealogy work, I've tried, you know, but I don't have the money to pay for Ancestry.com. And then sometimes it just stops,
Right.
because there's just no record. So those records are in financial, you know, or maybe notes that a superior wrote one evening in their journal. So we need all of those. We need you to look through those things to find those maybe seemingly nothing, but could mean a connection. So there's a response, and I really say there's especially for institutions of faith, based on faith, there is a responsibility. Our faith calls us to really honor, if we are made in the image and likeness of God, and there are people that we have not treated as such, we are duty and honored bound to restore that, and this is a way to do that. I don't know, practically speaking, I don't know where they would start, Kelly.
Well, I don't think anyone could have said it better than Danielle, but I think it's important to note, as Danielle was saying earlier about when she referenced California, like, this isn't something that happened in isolation.
Right.
All of the Catholic Church in the United States was involved in this. And even if we can't pinpoint direct ties, direct examples, we operated in American society, and as a society, we're inheritors of this history and its legacies of racism that still endure today. So I just want to reemphasize what Danielle has said, that we all have a role to play in this work.
Well, I'm going to make sure that I have the link to the website for you in the comments to this YouTube video. Thank you so much, Danielle and Kelly, for all your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.